Thank you very much for being here. I'm going to share my slides very quickly, so hopefully technology doesn't go against me and everything works okay. Can you just give me a thumbs up if you can see the slides all right? Yes? Marvellous, thank you very much. So as Dan said, I was the CIPR president last year and I was the CIPR Inside chair for a few years. Now the fabulous Martin has that task, I do believe. I've also worked in communication for almost 20 years. I've worked in-house for about 16 of those, and then I set up my own business about 4 years ago, which is called Redefining Communication. And my career in-house, I worked as an internal communications manager, I've worked as a media relations advisor, worked up to being a communications director, and I've worked in various industries, including pharma, hospitality and defence. So very much an in-house career for me up until setting up on my own. So I just wanted to give you that little bit of background for those of you that I don't know, so that you just know a little bit more about me. So this is my book. Thank you very much for having me today. I'm going to talk for probably about 20 minutes and then we'll go on to some Q&A. So if you've got questions, pop them in the chat or just ask me at the end, that's absolutely fine. So a lot of people ask me why I wrote the book and what it was that made me decide to suddenly think writing a book was going to be a really good idea. And the real truth of that is because I do believe that if we all just understood a bit more about people and communication, then work would be a much better place. And I believe that for everybody inside organisations. And when I first had the idea for the book, it was really designed for people that didn't work in communication. It was for kind of operations managers, commercial directors, anyone that was leading a team, that was communicating inside their organisation, and that was trying to make work better for the people that work with them. I also wrote the book because I had these two cheerleaders in my corner. So some of you will know Advita Patel and Trudy Lewis. They are also were part of the CIPR committee, and they are two of my best friends. And we now co-host a podcast together called Calm Edged Rebels. But the reason I talk about these two is because I originally came up with the idea for the book just before we went to Vancouver. And this was in June 2019. So this was us in Vancouver at the IABC International Conference where I was speaking about my research into remote workers. And they helped me pull together the brief, if you like, for the book for Kogan Page. So they helped me shape the contents, they helped me shape everything that was in my head, and they helped read it, review it, red pen it, and just helped me really bring that to life. They've also been there along the journey to kind of help me when I've got stuck, but they were huge parts of the encouragement for me to step forward and write it. One of the things I learned about from writing the book was referencing is everything. So you'll notice in the book at the end of each chapter, there are references to everything that I've read or I've looked at or I've watched that has supported creating each chapter. What I learned along the way is that sometimes you don't reference as you go. If anyone that is here is going to write a book, then reference as you go, because it's really painful to go back and do that at the end. It's also really important to do it. You know, we are in an industry where verifying what you're writing about and talking about is so important. So for me, referencing was a really big part of the book, but it was also one of the most challenging, especially when you actually can't find the reference that you thought you wrote down, and then you spend half a day trying to do that. Nightmare. The structure that you start with is unlikely to be what you end up with. So I had a very fixed view on the book being very much around the field model, which it is, and I'll talk about that shortly. But the structure that I had and then how that shifted was quite big. And part of that is because the publishers that I worked with, and I worked with Kogan Page deliberately because I wanted the support of a publisher. But what was helpful about doing that was that they would spot the blind spots in the content. And if you're a communicator and you're here, which I assume that most of you are, you'll know that when you get really close to something, sometimes it's hard to spot those gaps. And actually, there's a whole chapter now on chaos, which would never have existed had it not been for the publishers saying that that was probably the one bit that needed a bit more depth. I firmly believe that you'll make time for something if it's important, and you'll make excuses for something if you don't want to do it. And people will often say, I really, really want to write a book. I think I've got one in me. I've got so much to say, but then they never maybe get around to it. But if it's important, you will make the time. Writing the book wasn't the most challenging thing I've probably ever done, but writing it while being president in a global pandemic while supporting family and working at home was probably slightly more challenging than I had expected. The other thing is to know why you're doing it. You know, I had some comments quite early on from people that I didn't know who seemed to assume that everybody that was writing a book was doing it for their own ego. I was never doing it for any ego reason other than I genuinely live to serve the people that I work with. That's always been my mantra when I worked in an organization, and I genuinely want to change the world of work. And I just think if I can do just a little bit to help educate people in how powerful communication can be, then we can make the world a better place. And it's as simple as that. So know why you're doing it, always important. I wanted to cover just a bit around what the book covers. So if you haven't got a copy yet, you know what to expect, because the book is in 2 different sections. So I have the foundations at the start, and then I talk about applying the model. So the foundations are kind of those fundamental things that I think are really important for people to understand. So I cover an introduction to internal communication. That's fairly brief, but it's an important chapter for those who don't work in internal communication. And I also share in there the model that I've used for years to set up communication functions and create communication strategies and things like that. I mentioned the chapter on chaos, and I do have a whole chapter on that where I talk about chaos theory and the distinction between toxic chaos and normal chaos. And actually, it's probably at this point that I will just share a bit more about the chaos piece, because I think that's really important. So on this slide here, I talk about the difference between chaos theory and the reality of it. So this is from the book where I talk about the fact that chaos is all around us all of the time, but actually you can find order in chaos. There are patterns that you can find, and you can explore them, and you can delve into them, and you can find that calm. And what we tend to find is that we think chaos is people running around and being crazy and everything being slightly manic, and that's not the kind of chaos that we're talking about. And in the book, I talk about toxic chaos. And when I talk about toxic chaos, I talk about the fact that there are many people who will say that you need chaos to enable change, or that you need it for innovation and creativity. And to some degree, you do, that's true. But you need to be able to have freedom to think and explore and do things differently to ignite changes inside organizations. But this doesn't have to mean a chaotic system and an out of control organization. So when we look at chaos in a toxic sense, we can see that this has a negative impact on the employee experience. There doesn't need to be chaos that is detrimental to well-being, efficiency, or organizational success. And I believe there is a need for that distinction. And I know we often talk about change, constant change in organizations, but chaos is just that little bit different. So that's the chapter on chaos. I then talk about understanding organizations and leadership, and I go into a little bit of the theory around some of those, so different types of leadership. I talk about globalization. I talk a little bit about COVID-19 and the impact that's had as well. And the most important bit for me is understanding people. So I have a chapter where we talk about the understanding of the human brain. I draw on the work from Hilary Scarlett in her book, Neuroscience of Organizational Change. And I also draw on some of the other work from people like Tony Crabb, who wrote Busy, and also the book Sapiens. So there's lots of stuff that's being drawn on throughout the book to help everyone just get that kind of basic understanding. I then go on to talking about the field model, and I'll come on to talk about that in a second. And then I also have a chapter on data and diagnostics. So looking at the different ways you can diagnose what's going on inside organizations. That explores elements around bias and various different aspects of data collection. I then talk about fixing things, so how you can fix things inside organizations. And then the final chapter is about applying the model and making it work for the long term. And that's really important when it comes to the model, because the model is not about helping you do things that are going to be a quick win and then move forwards. It's about doing things for the long term that will make a difference. So the book, as I said, is designed for anyone who works in an organization. So that's why there's various different sections that allow you to learn about internal communication, no matter what role you're doing. So I said I talk about the field model. And the field model has 3 phases to it. So it's about understanding, diagnosing and fixing the issues inside organisations. And I always say to people, this can get really uncomfortable because you're starting to sometimes look at things that you don't really want to look at. And I do fundamentally believe that most issues inside organisations can be fixed with communication. Because organisations are people, and people need relationships to work together, and relationships thrive when there's good communication. So we have the 3 phases. We have the understand phase, which is really that first hurdle, if you like. So when I talk about this, I talk about symptoms quite a lot. So I talk about the symptoms you might have if this was a medical analogy. So I might have a headache, and that might be my symptom. And I might then go and treat that with a painkiller. Now I've jumped from understand to fix, essentially, without really understanding the root cause of that headache. If the root cause of that headache is that my eyes need testing and I need new glasses, then my fix is going to be different. It's going to be a trip to the opticians and new glasses. But so often we jump from understand to fix without thinking about really the root cause. So understand is the symptoms. In a business or an organisation, that might be things like people going off on stress. It might be high turnover of staff. It might be that you're going through an M&A. It might be that you're going through significant change, but there's stuff going on that's just making things not feel quite right. Work isn't quite getting done. And it can be as broad as that. What I like about the model, she says, having created it, is that you can apply it to an organisation, but you can also apply it to teams. So I'm working with someone at the moment where we're basically doing the field model on the communications function to understand how we can shift the perceptions and shift what the purpose is of that internal communication function. So it works on a team dynamic as well as an organisation dynamic. So that's kind of understanding. Then we get to diagnose. So the diagnosis is also really important for it to be just kind of bespoke to your team or your organisation. There's lots of people that would say you can just use a survey or you can just use a focus group, but actually the way you diagnose is so important because it says so much about how much you care about the symptoms that are in your organisation. But it's also making sure that you're using the right tools for the number of people and the right tools for the situation that you've got. And in the book, it kind of maps out which tools are going to be the right for which thing. But it's really important to have that time to diagnose and having the right questions without the bias, maybe, sometimes an external person asking the questions, but actually the question design is almost, the most important part of that. And then we've got the fix. And the fix is the bit where we will always explore strategy, leadership, and culture. We will also always explore probably blockers or toxic people inside the organisation. They're usually the core things that will always come up, but you'll be exploring things that need to be fixed that aren't just about channels and content. This is about fundamental communication changes inside the organisation. That might be policies, procedures, the way meetings run, who attends those meetings. It's all of those intricacies that make up an organisation, and that's what we're looking at, because all of that is about communication. If you've got too much power imbalance, if you've got the wrong people there, it's all that stuff that gets fixed. And this is the stuff that gets uncomfortable because you're often dealing with egos, you're often dealing with people that have been around quite a long time, and you're often dealing with a lot of legacy stuff, which can be really difficult. But the book takes you through all the different ways you can apply that fix. So that's the field model, and that's kind of the essence of the book, which is what I said I would cover today. We're going to jump into some questions to find out whether you've got anything that I can help you with. And for